Hello everybody, this is Tyler here once again from the Character Workshop. I do apologize for not wearing a fez for today's episode, but unfortunately I don't have any of those with me. So, this is the second to last episode of A Came From England Season 9, and in terms of production, this is actually the last one that I'm filming because I technically already filmed the last episode a while ago. It was meant to be the last episode, but things changed, and yeah. All that timey-wimey stuff, as they call it in Doctor Who, which, speaking of which, it has been over a year since I last did one of these Doctor era overviews. And I do these usually once or twice a season, where I basically cover an entire Doctor's era, like, in short form, like a synopsis, I guess you can say. Like, some of the key details and all that. I'm not going to do, like, any individual episode reviews here, just talking about an overall era. You guys have probably seen them before. I know some of you probably haven't, but still, just saying it for anybody who's new. So, we are now talking about the 11th Doctor this time around, played by Matt Smith. And this Doctor is rather interesting because at the time that he came out on the show, Matt Smith was the youngest actor at the time to play the Doctor, which previously Peter Davison back in Classic Who had the record of being the youngest Doctor, but Matt Smith took that record from him. He was 26 when he first played the character, back in April of 2010, which was when Series 5 first came out, which was the 11th Doctor's first season as such. And speaking of which, Series 5 was also the first season of Doctor Who to be run by Steven Moffat, who would basically be the showrunner of Doctor Who for the next several years. And Steven Moffat was a guy who wrote a couple of episodes during Russell T Davies' era with the 9th and 10th Doctor. And you're going to see when I talk about the Matt Smith era is that some of Steven Moffat's creations during the Russell T Davies era would also have a bigger role this time around. But with that being said, just gonna talk about the first of the 11th Doctor's seasons, that being Series 5. So the first episode premiered on April 3rd of 2010, which, by the way, happy belated 16-year anniversary to Series 5. And the episode was called The 11th Hour, and basically, the TARDIS crashes into England outside the home of a young girl by the name of Amelia Pond, or Amy Pond, as her nickname is, who invites the newly generated Doctor to investigate a crack that was in her bedroom wall, and says the Doctor needed the TARDIS to investigate on it. He promised that he will return to her in 5 minutes, which those 5 minutes actually ended up being 12 years, which, yeah, he didn't realize until much later, realizing that Amy is now an adult and is also working as a cop. And she also has a boyfriend named Rory Williams. During the events of this episode, they go after this shape-shifting alien known as Prisoner Zero, who escaped from the crack in Amy's wall. If the alien wasn't captured, Earth was going to be destroyed by a galactic police force known as the Atraxi. So, for being Matt Smith's first Doctor Who story, a lot of things were at stake here, which obviously they ended up saving the day, and Amy ends up joining the Doctor for their travels. So, rather interesting start to the Matt Smith era. As we'll get into with this video, there were a lot of controversies related to the Matt Smith era, and one of the first ones occurred in the third episode of Series 5, Victory of the Daleks. So this episode brought the Daleks back once again. Basically, they were in London during World War II, during the Blitz that happened over there. And the Daleks were there to, do what Daleks always do. And this time around, the Daleks that we were familiar with for most of Modern Who, which were referred to as the Time War Daleks, eventually ended up getting replaced by these newer Daleks, which they were called the Paradigm Daleks. Now, this was where a lot of the criticism started happening with this episode, is the way the Paradigm Daleks were designed. A lot of people think they were a bit too goofy, too colorful for Doctor Who, which, I don't know. I mean, they're not the greatest Dalek designs in my opinion, but at the same time, they're not that bad, in my opinion. As somebody who likes things that are colorful, like, they don't bother me as much as they bother some people. I mean, have you never seen the Peter Cushing Doctor Who movies from the 60s? Like, I feel like they were kind of going for that, although not really. So, unfortunately, the Paradigm Daleks didn't really do very well, and they were quickly phased out by the end of Matt Smith's era, with little to no explanation. But then the next episode will be a two-parter, which would feature the return of two Steven Moffat creations, that being River Song and the Weeping Angels, which River Song was a character who claimed in her first appearance back in Series 4 that she knows about the Doctor. Yep, she ends up returning in this story, and basically summons the Doctor and Amy to help her track down a Weeping Angel on a site of this ship that crashed on a planet. And yeah, this is basically the first time we actually got to see the Doctor like actually interact with the angels, because in the Weeping Angel's first appearance in Blink from Series 3, like, we never got to see any on-screen scenes of the Doctor or the companion interacting with the Weeping Angels, because in that episode, the only people we saw interacting with the Weeping Angels were the one-time characters that were in that episode. But this time we actually got to see the main cast interact with the Weeping Angels, which I thought was interesting. And after the end of that two-parter, basically Amy and Rory were announced to get married, because I should have said this at first, but the Doctor and Amy, after the events of the story, end up going back to present-day Earth. And then in the next episode, Rory actually joins them in their next adventure, and afterwards he would end up being kind of a third member of the TARDIS crew along with the Doctor and Amy. That was up until episodes 8 and 9 of Series 5, which was a two-parter, which reintroduced the Silurians into Doctor Who with new, updated designs. To be honest, I've never been the biggest fan of how human their faces looked. I get they're meant to be like reptilian relevance? Reptilian relatives of humans. But I don't know, man, they just looked off-putting. Then again, in my opinion, the Classic Who designs were much better, but regardless, the Silurians were back, and unfortunately, after the events of this episode, Rory ended up dying, and he was consumed by a crack, which ended up basically erasing him from existence, and also erased Amy's memory of Rory. So, after this episode, she had no idea who Rory is, or if he ever existed. And then the next two episodes basically had the Doctor and Amy going back to Vincent Van Gogh in one episode, and the next episode, The Lodger introduced a character by the name of Craig Owens, played by James Corden, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with, for better or for worse. And him and the Doctor have like such good dynamics. It's kind of a shame he wasn't like a full-time companion for the series, but regardless, he was a lot of fun. And then we get to the two-part finale of Series 5, and this basically, one of the main interesting aspects of the two-parter in Series 5 that ended the series was the fact that Rory somehow came back, but this time he was an Auton. And this actually confused the Doctor at first. He looked at Rory, he was like, "Rory, you died." And Rory's like, "Yeah, I know." And that just was pretty funny in my opinion, but yeah, apparently Rory wasn't completely dead like a lot of people thought he was. So after the events of the two-parter, Amy and Rory end up coming back together. I think Amy eventually gets her memories back of Rory, so they're back to being a couple, and they're back to traveling with the Doctor, as per usual. And then a year later, in 2011, we get to Series 6, and it starts off with a two-parter, which once again brings back River Song, working alongside Amy, Rory, and the Doctor. This time they're in Utah, around 1969, when basically the moon landing happens. And this introduced like a new breed of monsters into Doctor Who, which I think is a very like fascinating new species in the show. They are referred to as the Silents, which a singular version of the Silent would be a Silent, if that makes any sense. So, one of the cool things about the Silents is that their designs are heavily based off of Edvard Munch's 1893 painting of The Scream. And basically, the concept of these creatures is that after a human turns away from the Silents, they won't be able to remember actually seeing them, which I think is rather interesting and a very creative concept. And kind of a creepy design too, like just a lot of cool things about them. Definitely one of the best like new monsters that were introduced during the Matt Smith era, in my opinion. And then we have The Doctor's Wife, which was an episode where the TARDIS, you know, the police box thing that the Doctor and the companions travel in, becomes a human in this story. So, not really much else to say there. One other thing I will point out about The Doctor's Wife, this episode was actually written by Neil Gaiman, which for anybody who is very familiar with Neil Gaiman's name, yes, this guy was the author of the popular book Coraline, which ended up becoming a very successful stop-motion film in 2009. So, yeah, he also wrote a script for Doctor Who, which very interesting. Then we get to an episode 8 in Series 6, which I think is rather very confusing for a lot of things. The episode's title might surprise some of you guys that they were able to get away with saying this. The episode's title is Let's Kill Hitler. And basically the storyline involved this person by the name of Mel's, who was a childhood friend of Amy, who ended up traveling with Dr. Amy and Rory. And she actually ended up like being able to hijack them and hijack the TARDIS to travel back to kill Hitler, which ended up not working very well, which Mel's ends up getting shot in the process. And the weirdest part of the story is that Mel's regenerated into River Song, which I'm thinking, huh? Like, I don't recall. It's been a couple years since I've seen this episode. I don't remember what their reasoning was for why this was a thing, but yeah. So that was quite an episode. Not much else to really say about that. And then Craig from the Lodger episode of Series 5 actually returns again for the closing time episode of Series 6. And this time around, Craig now has a child. And this story also features the return of the Cybermen. This was their first main role on the show as villains since the Next Doctor Christmas special from 2008. And this also featured the return of the Cybermen, who have not been seen since the 70s. So, been almost 40 years since these little guys have last been seen on the show. Which, in the episode does end with like Craig almost being converted into a Cyberman himself, but he heard his son crying, which ended up like giving him enough strength to like break free of being converted into the Cybermen, which I guess kind of has this very common trope like, oh, love wins in the end, which, I mean, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, very on the nose, I guess you could say, not like, the most subtle of references, I guess. And something I also forgot to mention, in the episode before closing time, which was the God Complex, Amy and Rory actually initially left the Doctor because they were worried about them being killed, because of, you know, their adventures with him. So, yeah, they were absent throughout closing time, but they ended up returning in the last episode of Series 6, The Wedding of River Song. So then after the events of the 2011 Christmas special, The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe, which was heavily based off of the Narnia books, he ended up visiting Amy and Rory at the very end of that special, and they ended up reuniting and going back to traveling. However, in the first episode of Series 7, which came out in September of 2012, Asylum of the Daleks. So, they ended up being kidnapped by the Daleks, who actually asked them to, like, destroy this planet of theirs that they use as, like, an asylum for, like, messed up Daleks, which kind of a bit bizarre when you really think about it, because, like, Daleks, they hate anything that's not them, including inferior Daleks. Like, why would they just, like, bother putting them like elsewhere instead of just like exterminating them. Like, what? So, Asylum with the Daleks also featured a new character by the name of Oswin Oswald, and not much to really say about her in this episode other than the fact that it ended up, despite being able to communicate to the Doctor, not 100% sure how they were able to do it, somehow linked to one another. Her and the Doctor were able to talk to one another, and apparently it was revealed near the end that she was in a Dalek casing, so she wasn't really 100% human, but was still able to help the Doctor in his adventures regardless. Also, one other thing to point out about this episode that I think is rather interesting, Oswin ended up interfering with the Daleks' memory. She basically removed like any like memory that the Daleks have of the Doctor, so now they won't even like recognize him or realize that he's their worst enemy, which is interesting.